hormones.
The next slides kind of discuss more of the feedbacks, kind of a review of what we discussed last time. So I kind of like put these slides together just to illustrate the they call these pituitary axes because it's like from top to bottom how the hypothalamus will release hormones from the pituitary, in this case the posterior, and kind of what it targets downstream of that. And so this first one is the pituitary axis for ADH. Now ADH, also known as vasopressin, we discussed it the last time. The stimulus for its release is dehydration or thirst. The physiological effect, as we said, it targets the kidney, and the response is the insertion of the aquaporin molecules. So the effect, you increase AQP, that's aquaporin. They're water pores.
Is it aquaporin 2 or just aquaporin water pores?
It is 2. I don't expect you to remember 2.
Okay.
But the word aquaporin is important. So when you increase those molecules, the physiology was increased water reabsorption. And the effect of that was to increase blood volume, increase blood pressure. And that would counteract the dehydration. So, adequate hydration inhibits ADH. And we all have experienced that where you drink plenty of water and you have to go. It increases your urine output. The misconception is people think, oh, it goes right through me. What really happens is you're inhibiting ADH and the kidneys are increasing urine output. Okay. All right, so I'm going to move on from this. ADH was talked about a lot. I didn't talk about the physiology of oxytocin so much. And so this is more significant in females. In males, no physiological significance that I know of. So let's talk about oxytocin. Oxytocin is known to target smooth muscle in female reproductive structures. Specifically of uterus and the mammary glands. The breasts. In particular, the smooth muscle of the uterus. Well, for example, when you're in labor and ready to give birth, there's a stretching of the uterine wall. The uterus is a kind of an upside down pear-shaped organ. We'll talk about it when we get to repro. With a uterine cavity. And the wall really stretches thin when you have a 7-pound baby in there, and that causes the uterine stretching. And also the cervix begins to dilate because baby's head is pushing down head first, and it's starting to thin out the cervix wall. And the cervix starts to dilate to allow baby's head to get through. So, during all these events, those are stimuli to release oxytocin. So I'm going to call that uterine stretching, referring to the stretching of the uterine wall. This lower neck portion is called the cervix of the uterus. So the whole thing is uterus, but the cervix is this bottom part. The cervix of the uterus. So uterine stretching and cervical dilation stimulate oxytocin's release. What are the vertebra of the neck called? Which region is that? Cervical. Cervix means neck, so that's like the neck of the uterus. All right, so oxytocin will stimulate the contraction of the muscle in the uterine wall. So imagine a thick layer of muscle throughout. It's a big muscle layer. So what I drew in red symbolizes the smooth muscle of the uterus. The contractions, which are painful, okay, I'll just tell you how far are the contractions apart. These contractions, will they help to push baby out? Okay. Help deliver baby. The other smooth muscle for milk letdown in the mammary glands, there are glands which produce the milk, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the duct system that lets the milk out. The ducts are lined with smooth muscle. So also smooth muscle of mammary ducts. It makes the smooth muscle contract a way that opens the duct and lets the milk down. We call it milk letdown, milk ejection. So the smooth muscle contracts in a way. Dilate means open up. Dilates ducts, facilitates milk letdown, not milk production. That's another hormone. Dilates ducts, facilitates milk let down. So that's another cause of oxytocin. So what stimulates this is actually the suckling of a nursing infant. Okay, that'll stimulate this effect. So I'll squeeze in suckling infant. That'll kind of stimulate the milk letdown while nursing. Now I also put in sex arousal. They refer to oxytocin as released during intimacy after female orgasm. So it's also stimulated during what we call the female sex response in the physiology class. But I always say as a joke, if you have sex with your pregnant wife, you're risking a squirt in the face, right? Because the milk let down and she's probably lactating. I say that as a joke, okay? I'm not trying to get myself in trouble, but that is the physiology. All right, well, I want to move on to the next one. Any questions on the effects of oxytocin? let down, uterine contraction. Okay. Well, the next one is I have more slides on it later, but thyroid hormone. But we talked about this before. Thyrotropin releasing hormone stimulates the thyrotropin, releases thyroid stimulating hormone. And the thyroid gland releases thyroid hormone. So thyroid hormone is responsible for boosting metabolism. That's the body's overall way of just burning energy for fuel. Under TSH control. I have more slides on thyroid hormone later. The physiology is pretty complicated. The TH stands for thyroid hormone. And thyroid hormone is kind of a generic name. There's more specific subtypes of thyroid hormone referred to as T3, T4. So T3 and T4 refer to the number of iodine molecules that are attached to it. So iodine is an essential element important for the formation of T3 and T4. And T3 has an alternate name called triiodothyronine. And T4 is also known as thyroxine. Okay, so these are kind of thyroid hormone. When we say that, you actually mean T3, T4. And you can also call T3, T4 these alternate names. And these have the effect, I say thermic effect, that's another way of saying boosting metabolism, burn calories. Now the formation of T3 and T4 is pretty complex. You have the thyroid gland, and when we look at it under a microscope today, microscopically, it has a very interesting arrangement. Well, I don't know, let me draw a cell. To make T3 and T4, you actually have a bunch of cells arranged in a complete sphere. So let me draw this as part of a simple cuboidal ET, epithelial layer. So imagine a sphere that's hollowed out on the inside. And when you cut the sphere and look inside, you can see the hollowed out center. The hollowed out center is filled with a substance. That's referred to as the colloid.
And that's a thyroid gland, the whole thing, is that what you said?
No, this is a structure within the thyroid gland, and let's call it the follicle. It's microscopic.
Oh, that's a follicle? Okay, perfect.
Yeah, this is, well, let's call it the thyroid follicle.
Okay, perfect.
Follicle is a common word used in physiology. It just means, I'd always think of a jelly donut. Because what do you expect to find on the inside of a jelly donut? Jelly? Well, the point is, you expect to find something on the inside of anything called follicle. In this case, it's the colloid. Now, what the colloid is, think of it as inactive thyroid hormone, inactive T3, T4. And so I'll just say inactive TH. Of course, there's a name for it. We call it thyroglobulin. Thyroglobulin. The reason why it's inactive, what element does it need? Iodine. The thing about cells, they can't produce elements of the periodic table. They can only make proteins. So they can make thyroglobulin, which is a globular protein, but they can't make the iodine. So you have to get it from your diet, like table salt, right? So there's a process where the cell, it does what it can. It makes thyroglobulin. See these little red dots, thyroglobulin. Most cells will keep the hormone that it makes inside the cell, but it's not the case for thyroid. It does this thing where all the cells, they secrete the thyroglobulin to this storage center in the middle. I guess you can think of it as a storage center. And the cell has a way, there's a blood vessel, and if iodide molecules flow by because it's in your diet, it has a way to extract the iodine, I'll call it I2, from the blood and kind of like in this location, take the iodide and iodinate the the thyroglobulin and make T3, T4. Okay, so let me write that down. Right, it's was follicle cells.
So they get the iodine from the blood,
Yeah,
and then it mixes with the thyroglobulin?
you got it.
Okay.
Follicle cells extract iodine from blood and form T3, T4. Now I wanted to kind of teach that now because we're going to see follicles when we look at the microscope today when I present the slide. Now there's a lot of details I'm not teaching now. I'll just teach them later. The main thing is I want you to know that thyroid hormone is T3 and T4. Okay. So think about how feedbacks work. If you have elevated levels of T3, T4, you mostly secrete T4. But basically, elevated levels of thyroid hormone will negatively feed back on the hypothalamus. Okay. So let me write that down. Increase thyroid hormone. You get negative feedback, FB feedback on TRH, and as a result, TSH. So we'll move on to the next one, and that is growth hormone and its physiological effects. It's a great name for it. It causes growth in young people and young adults. It's the hormone of your youth, and even in elderly people, it's influenced by activity level. So if your activity level is high, human growth hormone levels will be high. Now there's a lot of information on this slide. When growth hormone, releasing hormone, stimulates its release from somatotropes, there's two major categories of what it does. Anabolic, anti-insulin effects of growth hormone. Whenever you see the word anabolic in physiology, it means tissue building. The opposite will be catabolism, which means break down. The anabolic effects, basically you're increasing your lean mass. In the human body, very simply, it breaks down to two things, fat and lean mass. Lean mass includes muscle, bone, and blood. Fat is fat. And it's about 80-20 on average, okay? To increase your lean mass, that's one thing. Specifically, increase muscle mass. But you're also increasing bone and cartilage growth. Now, growth hormone doesn't do this directly. On the slide it says indirect action, because what growth hormone actually does, it targets the liver to produce insulin-like growth factors. Growth hormone, GH, targets liver to produce IGFs, insulin-like growth factors. Or IGS for short. And through IGS will have this effect on increasing your lean mass. So it acts through insulin-like growth factors. And you know, whenever you see anyone refer to insulin, insulin is the major anabolic hormone. It just builds things, stores. Basically, I always think if you eat a large meal, go to bed, insulin does its job. You store everything you ate. Okay, so in this case, this is not insulin, but these are growth factors that have insulin-like effects to increase your lean mass. And growth hormone facilitates their release from the liver. Okay, so anabolic tissue building. But it also does the opposite of what insulin does. That's why I say anti-insulin effects. If insulin is like anabolic, anti-insulin is break it down. Break down your fat stores, break down your glycogen stores to increase glucose. So I say increase FFAs. That's an abbreviation for free fatty acids. So let's just say break down fat. I think you understand that. Fat, your body mostly stores it in a molecule called I always draw it as a backbone with 3 hydrocarbon chains, triglycerides. Look up triglycerides. I believe it's discussed in chapter 2. You forgot what those are. Teach that in 430. Well, anyways, triglycerides is basically the storage form of fat. If you want to break that down, a good way to do it is to cleave off each of those hydrocarbon chains, which are called fatty acids. So each one of these is a fatty acid. Just a hydrocarbon chain. Hydrogen and carbon, that's it. So if you cleave that off at this location, at this location, and this location, they'll be free. They're liberated from the glycerol backbone, and they can circulate freely. So if this hydrocarbon chain is they're just circulating free from glycerol, and they can actually, this is the molecule, these free fatty acids. They're free to circulate, and they can enter the muscle cell, and that's what you break down. You metabolize it, you burn it. That's your fuel source. So this hormone breaks down the fat and increases the circulating amounts of these, so you can use it to burn for fuel. So basically, you're decreasing adiposity of the body fats, right? You're breaking it down. Decrease adiposity, which is just a fancy way of saying break down fat. And the other fuel source you need is glucose. So you're going to basically deplete your glycogen stores. I'll say break down glycogen, increase glucose. Break down glycogen, increase blood glucose. So you have more fat and glucose to burn. It's circulating in your blood and your body cells can use it. It's almost like you use these energy substrates, the fat and the carb, to do this over here, to build things. And so if your activity level is high, that'll happen more. So I'm going to move on. Any questions on the effects of growth hormone? All right, this is a slide on prolactin. And prolactin, we need to kind of talk about it in context with the female ovarian and menstrual cycle versus when a female is pregnant. Okay? So two different scenarios. So female production of prolactin, consider the normal, on average, 28-day menstrual cycle. Basically, not pregnant, going through your normal cycle because you're not pregnant. Menstrual, menses, which means month. Okay, so on average it's about 28 days. That's kind of what we teach in the textbook. It could vary, but you're not pregnant, and we'll go through the details of this. But in that 28 days, basically, there's about a couple of weeks where estrogen's kind of low, and a couple of weeks where it's higher. Okay. So higher estrogen will stimulate the release of PRH. Increase estrogens. And the term estrogens refers to an entire class of hormones referred to as estrogens. To name a couple, there's estradiol, the main one, and estrone, so the two main ones I usually read about. Anyways, those are increased a little bit during the normal cycle. I mean, what estrogens do is they try to develop the uterine wall, trying to get ready for pregnancy, because you just had menses. You're not pregnant, so you kind of rebuild, and then maybe you get pregnant the next cycle. Well, anyways, in terms of prolactin, increased PRH, increased prolactin, but usually not enough to get full-on milk production, but maybe there's some breast tenderness and swelling. Okay. You're not pregnant, but it's a normal cycle. So obviously, less estrogens turn it off. That's why I say there. Now during pregnancy, the placental hormones, well basically you have a lot more estrogens during pregnancy and lactation. So I'll just illustrate two up arrows that let you know that there's a lot more estrogens circulating. Therefore, you get a lot more prolactin releasing hormone and a lot more prolactin. You get full-on lactation, milk production. In mammary glands. So breast is the region But the gland structure in the breast is what we're talking about. That is what is specifically targeted by prolactin, PRL. And it's why we're all called mammals, right? We all feed our young with milk. So prolactin. In men, don't got it. Very low estrogen, so basically no breast development in men. It's the androgens, not the estrogens that dominate in men. We'll talk about those. So I left some half sheets over there, and usually when I get to this part of the lecture, I didn't even make slides for ACTH and FSH, LH, but I do want you to know the axes for those. So what I thought I'd do is give you a few minutes now on your half sheet, see if you can kind of like, you know, make this, draw it small and simple, but do it for ACTH and FSH, LH.
What was that, ACTH and?
Yeah, those two. So make two of them. Do it now. Go ahead and look in your book if you feel like you need to look it up. You don't have a half sheet. There should be some over there. The half sheet. Two pituitary axes. Call it number 1 for ACTH, that one. Number 2 for the gonadotropins, FSH, LH.
down the line of what it is. So the thalamus releases that, and that releases that. So this would be, and this is neuro. This releases,
just tropes.
because these are all hypothalamus hormones. And that releases this hypothalamus hormone. And then it goes over to the pituitary cells, the corticotrophs. Yes. Strengthening neurosine and then hypothalamus. And then, adrenal corticotropic hormones, or corticotropic, secreted by the corticotropic cells. Yes, we got that. Yeah, so, well, it doesn't say hypothalamus, but we know it's hypothalamus because it says over here. So I put neurostimulation for that, I put in hypothalamus, tropic hormones, corticotropic releasing hormones released, and then the anterior pituitary cells, corticotropes, release anterior pituitary hormones, which is, and then one of the
adrenal cortex secretes glucocorticoids and androgens.
Pituitary split, it goes to relaxation of the stimulating adrenal corticoids to release steroids. Importantly, go to help the body against stressors.
So we're still going to start with the hypothalamus.
I was looking at the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands. Okay, so its target is the adrenal, what did I just say? Secreted by the corticotropic. Corticotropin, the releasing hormone is released, goes to the anterior pituitary cells, what are called corticotropes, and it goes to the anterior pituitary hormone, known as ACTH. So anterior pituitary hormone is pituitary cells,
It was like, I don't want to do that again. I laid it out in a movable way, like first, and then when it was set, I did like, I had to keep redoing it.
Where it starts, what it stimulates, what hormone is stimulated, what your target cell is, and what the response is.
Okay, so it starts with the
Yes. Yeah, so releases corticosteroid hormone. So most levels are elevated. It's really the removal of stress that's the main thing that. But what you should add to that.
It releases CRH.
I haven't caught this yet, but corticosteroids is
Corticosteroid hormone.
And that's what happens. To cause this
Yeah, so adrenal cortex to release corticosteroid hormone.
I want to move on in just a minute, and I'll give you more time later on this if you need it. I'll give you another minute. I want to move on, but I want to get some feedback on this, see what you did. For example, for ACTH, as I've outlined it here in your discussions and what you wrote, which box would you put it in? Top, middle, or bottom? Where does this go? What do you think?
I know where
It goes in the middle. Hypothalamus, pit, and some other gland. Well, what goes above it? What controls its release? CRH, she's got that. So CRH, and you're stressed out. This is a stress response hormone. CRH is released. Stress. I have a test Friday. CRH, ACTH. What'd you put on the bottom there? Anyone put anything? It targets the adrenal cortex. And the secretions are, you should have read it in the book, or I'll teach it. Corticosteroids. And so I also said to discuss feedbacks, like negative feedback. If you get corticosteroids, elevated levels, should turn it off, or removal of stress. So I kind of like fed that to you there. And then let's see what you did for this next one, number 2. Fsh Lh. Which box does it go in? Top, middle, or bottom? Middle again. These are both secretions of the pituitary. Now, the pituitary is under hypothalamic control. Which one did we talk about last time that controls its release? Do you remember? Yeah, gonadotropin releasing hormone controls its release. Fsh Lh, we call them gonadotropins. So what glands does it target? Yeah, the gonads. And do you remember the names of the sex hormones we talked about? Well, if you're a man, testosterone. If you're a woman, estrogen. So I'll just put TST, testosterone, and EST. So if you get elevated levels of sex hormones, those should kind of negative feedback and turn it off. So I'll be interested to see what you wrote, but you know, you should have come close to that if you're kind of following me here. That's kind of why I do this, is to check for understanding. Also to review, the last time we talked about this. Let's also do this on your half sheet. Call it number 3, ABC. On your half sheet, go. I'll give you a couple of minutes. So go back and look at your notes from yesterday and use the picture. It's different, but of the same thing. See if you can answer those questions, A, B, and C. For those of you that are done with this, move on to the next slide. Make this number 4 ABC, and then we'll continue with lecture. We'll give you another minute, then we'll continue with lecture. All right, we'll move on. The plan is to end class a little early today, and I'll give you, at that time, if you need more time to work this out, you can stay and finish the half-sheet question. But I want to move on with lecture now. And we're actually finished with those slides. And these slides start with adrenal glands. That's what I want to do next. These adrenal glands sit on top of your kidneys. So because they sit on the kidneys, the adrenal glands are also called suprarenal glands. Renal refers to kidney. Think of this gland as your major stress response endocrine gland. Whether it be long-term or short-term stress response. When we say long-term, could be days, weeks, months. Days, weeks, longer. Short-term is like minutes. Maybe hours, but on that order of scale, okay? Long-term and short-term. And if you cut the gland open, this is the organization that you see. This right here. Now it's completely covered with a fibrous capsule, which has no physiological function that I'm aware of. But it's there, so let's note it. And the outer part, all the way around, I said this before, from there to there. Outer part is cortex. The corticosteroids released from the cortex are for the long-term stress response. We'll make that association. And then from here to here, what I said in the previous lecture, from there to there, that's medulla. That's for short term. So the secretions are, the cortex will secrete major classes of corticosteroids. They are under the control mostly of ACTH. ACTH is the hormone from the pituitary that targets the adrenal cortex. And for the medulla, I said the stimulation was neural. What they secrete are your catecholamines, epi-norepi. I'll just say E-N-E for short. And I said it's under sympathetic control, a neural stimulation, is what we talked about last time. So I'll put SYM to remind you of that. Okay, so that's kind of the anatomy of the gland, how it associates with the physiology there. So you do need to know the secretions there. The long-term stress response, corticosteroids help the body deal with that. To deal with short-term stresses, your catecholamines, E and NE from the medulla help you deal with that. Now, this is a less than perfect picture, but I gotta tell you, it's from our collection. And sometimes I take pictures just like you're gonna see. If you don't bother to use the glass lens cleaner that we have, you get dusty pictures like this. Hey, but they're still usable. I have it bracketed, but if it wasn't labeled, do you think you could see cortex and medulla there? Okay, if you know what you're looking at, I would say yeah. And the reason why it's important to know about the capsule is because you'll confuse it with the top part of the cortex if you don't identify it. So a capsule is a thin fibrous connective tissue, but the cells of the cortex are quite different. Okay, so well, what I want to do.
So are you saying you start off with your landmark as the capsule? That's the
Yeah.
first thing?
So let's use this to kind of like piggyback off that comment. So if I look at the outermost thing, it's the capsule. Then there's all these zones within the cortex. Okay, that's why it's important to know the capsule first. Because, well, before you can answer this question, let me talk about the zones. kind of just draw this again. Capsule in blue. Let's take the cortex and divide it into 3 zones. So I got 3 zones all the way around just the cortex. I'm going to put a letter G at the outermost zone. I'm going to put an F for the broadest middle zone and an R for the inner zone. This divides the cortex into 3 zones, and each zone secretes a different corticosteroid for long-term stress response. Three zones of the adrenal cortex. This is what the ACTH will stimulate. Okay. Now that outermost zone, G, stands for Zona Glomerulosa. Let me go to the next slide to show you this. So what you're looking at here is a small section of cortex. Okay. Like on my picture here. If you only look at this, you know, and you get that figure. The outermost zone, Zona Glomerulosa, refers to the fact that the cells are arranged into oval clumps. Here's the illustration next to the real picture there. So you got capsule, but then Zona Glomerulosa. So the arrangement of the cells, oval clumps. That's why they gave it that name. It turns out, glomer, that word root means ball of yarn. Okay. Hence the name glomerulosa. Now, okay, so that's the appearance of the cells. They secrete a class of hormones called mineral corticoids. There's only one you gotta know, aldosterone.
That's the mineral corticoid?
Yeah, and it's the one you gotta know. We talked about it last time. It facilitates sodium reabsorption from the kidney. Sodium reabsorption from kidney. Go back and look at your notes from yesterday. The middle zone, the F, that's Zona fasciculata. I'm going to erase this here. Again, describe how the cells are arranged. These kind of vertical cords. What I would note is it tends to be the broadest zone. Okay. Broadest zone. And they secrete hormones that are a class of corticosteroids called the glucocorticoids. And the most important one you gotta know, cortisol. Just know cortisol and aldosterone. Okay? Cortisol has a way to increase blood glucose levels. Hence the term glucocorticoids. So retained salt, increased blood glucose, those are great stress responses.
So G and F are stress responses?
Yeah, those are the two main ones.
The two main ones.
Yeah, aldosterone, blood glucose. And let's remember, when you reabsorb sodium, what I tried to really emphasize yesterday was, what follows sodium?
Water.
Water. Water follows, and you increase blood volume, increase blood pressure. Now the innermost zone, on this slide, they make it really big. I usually don't see it that big, this Zona Reticularis. I don't talk about it too much. It's responsible for releasing sex hormones. The function of which is not well understood. The main source of sex hormones are the gonads, not the adrenal cortex. But they're there. Some people think they may help initiate, kick off puberty. Just know that that zone is there and they secrete sex hormones. There's an easy way to remember the secretions. I always tell students, just remember salt, sugar, sex, right? Because Zona Reticularis secretes aldosterone that helps retain salt. Zona fasciculata, cortisol, helps increase the blood sugar. And then Zona Reticularis secretes the sex hormones. Okay? So just remember salt, sugar, sex. I don't really talk about the sex hormones too much. I mostly talk about the adrenal cortex, specifically the aldosterone. We talk about that a lot in this class. There's the molecular structure, although you're not responsible for it. But you should know the general structure of corticosteroids and steroid hormones in general. These 4 flat hydrocarbon rings. I did teach that the last time. You should know that. Well, the sugar, cortisol, that's the main glucocorticoid you got to know from Zona fasciculata. The Zona Reticularis is sex hormones. So the adrenal medulla, that's your epi and norepi, and there's the molecular structure of norepinephrine. So to go back to corticosteroids, I included this slide to impress upon students. All corticosteroids are derived from cholesterol. They're all closely related. All corticosteroids are derived from cholesterol. Now this isn't a figure I expect you to memorize or anything, but I just wanted to point out, I point out literally the ones I just had you write down. Aldosterone right here. There's cholesterol up here. You can kind of see the enzymatic conversion of these molecules into what you got to know. There's aldosterone, there's cortisol, and here are your sex hormones. One thing you should write down that I do emphasize for repro is, well, pretty much the gender differences between men and women. It's one hormone, aromatase. Aromatase converts androstenedione to estrone and testosterone to estradiol. You should write that down for the sex hormones. More on that in repro. Androstenedione converted by aromatase estrone is an estrogen. And then testosterone converted to estradiol. By aromatase. People who research sex differentiation study aromatase. It's very important. Okay, so that'll come up again. So the zona glomerulosa, I want to go into the details of how it's stimulated or how it's inhibited. And the main thing I put in bold, it helps maintain or increase blood pressure in a stress response. Okay, it regulates sodium, as I've said, and the ways you stimulate it and ways you inhibit are detailed for you on this figure from the Marriott textbook. So call this zona glomerulosa stimulation. Stimulated by, number one, the RAAS mechanism. I call it RAS for short. Put a check mark next to that, star it. I want to go through that in great detail, and you're expected to be able to write about that on the exam, so I'll get back to that. That's one stimuli. Rising, potassium, let's put low sodium. Because it secretes aldosterone, which retains sodium, so low sodium would be a direct release for it. And thirdly, good old stress, which releases increased levels of ACTH. That'll stimulate. So all these different things that will help stimulate that outermost zone, the zona glomerulosa. In effect, it will maintain or boost blood pressure. So if blood pressure is too high, one mechanism of inhibition inhibited by atrial natriuretic peptide. It comes from the heart. AMP for short. If blood pressure is too high, this can be monitored by the heart, you'll inhibit aldosterone. And by doing that, you can decrease blood pressure. Okay. So, in a nutshell, these top three, just think to yourself, the physiology somehow going to boost blood pressure by retaining salt. This one, decrease blood pressure. Okay. That's the effect. All right, so that first one I had to put a check mark by. Let me go through the details of what that is. This is, what it has on the slide here is a little incomplete, so I want to make sure you have all the details. So let's talk about this RAS. So let's think about this. You're stressed out. You're usually the long-term stress response, the physiologists call it the starvation death camp scenario. Maybe you're a prisoner of war and you have a very small ration of food and you treat it very inhumanely, whatever it is. How do you survive? What does the body do to get you through a long-term stress response? Maybe you're homeless. Maybe you're lost in the woods for a week. Okay. What does the body do to survive for days or weeks? And so to help maintain blood pressure, well, let's say you're dehydrated, something like that. And that is a trigger because you have low blood volume. you affect the kidney. Okay, so that's kind of the situation you're dealing with. What the kidney will do to help is it'll secrete renin. R-E-N-I-N. Renin will enter the bloodstream. So renin gets into the blood, enters the bloodstream. And what renin will do, well, first I also have to mention this. So you have the liver too. So here's the blood. And the renin has to enter the bloodstream. The liver will also secrete a molecule called angiotensinogen. Now angiotensinogen, let me draw it as, how about a long green squiggly line that has to also enter the bloodstream. And the liver always produces it. Angiotensinogen happens to be a molecule that's pretty inactive. What will happen is renin is a cleaver. It'll kind of like act on the angiotensinogen, and renin cleaves angiotensinogen and it converts it into a molecule called angiotensin 1. Renin cleaves angiotensinogen and it converts it into angiotensin 1. Roman numeral 1. You can call it AMG1 for short. Now angiotensin 1 doesn't really do the physiology we want to know about. But what happens is angiotensin 1 will travel to the lung capillaries, the pulmonary capillaries. So let's pretend I have a pulmonary capillary here. So this angiotensinogen has been cleaved. So maybe this long green squiggly line, let me draw it a little shorter. Okay, it's been cleaved. Now we call it angiotensin 1. Okay, so maybe that's ANG1 right there. And in the pulmonary capillaries, there's another enzyme called ACE. ACE. Now ACE stands for angiotensin converting enzyme. An angiotensin converting enzyme, ACE for short, is also a cleaver. It will cleave, how about little orange balls here for ACE? It'll cleave angiotensin 1 and turn it into angiotensin 2. So let's just go Ang1 converting to Ang2. Okay, so it's very important that you know ACE is responsible to the conversion from Ang1 to Ang2. Okay, it cleaves it again. So maybe Ang2 is a very even shorter green squiggly line. Okay. The point is, you just took a long molecule, angiotensinogen, you cleaved off part of it, angiotensin 1, you cleaved off more of it, and now you got angiotensin 2. Now finally, you get to the molecule that's important, angiotensin 2. That's actually the molecule that can help in the stress response. And on the figure, they have it here, and it targets the Zona Reticularis. So I'm going to erase this first part here. So let's take angiotensin 2, bring it over here. Now there's two main effects that angiotensin 2 can do to help raise blood pressure. It can directly act on arterioles and vasoconstrict them. That will help increase BP. The other thing it can do, as we've been talking about, it targets Zona Reticularis. And the string events that happened after that, you get increased circulating levels of aldosterone. And what does that do? You get your sodium reabsorption. And what does that do? Well, when that happens, water follows, increased blood volume, increased blood pressure. Alpha H2O follows. Increased blood volume, increase blood pressure. So what we've done here, we've discussed two mechanisms of how the body can increase blood pressure. So all of that, from renin to angiotensin, to angiotensin 1, to angiotensin 2, to aldosterone, know the whole thing. Okay, I didn't write it on the board for nothing. And I wanted to show a slide of how renin and ACE are cleavers. You see how I'm just taking a longer molecule and just cleaving part of it off? They're cleavers. That's how they do the conversion. And if you don't take good notes and you miss some of that, well, of course you can watch it on YouTube. It's recorded, but you can refer to this. It's a nice summary. The whole point is stress response. So you're dehydrated, sodium deficiency, hemorrhage means bleeding. You've lost fluids, blood volume, whatever. Decreased blood volume, decrease in pressure. The kidneys are affected by that. You increase renin. Here's the liver secreting angiotensinogen. The first cleaving happens here. Renin cleaves angiotensinogen into ANG1. In the lung capillaries, those are the lungs, ACE will convert it to ANG2. And angiotensin 2 can either vasoconstrict arterioles or act on the adrenal cortex to increase aldosterone. And in the kidneys, you get the sodium, water reabsorption, increased blood volume right there. And both of these increase blood pressure. So that's a nice summary to refer to if you want to keep practicing and practicing. And I think you ought to for the test. Now, when you know a cascade, I guess the frustrating things for students is, oh man, I have to memorize this. But it's very useful for pharmaceutical companies. If you know a cascade and you can introduce your drug to stop it, you can help treat patients who are hypertense. Because if this increases blood pressure during a stress response, if you're hypertense for other reasons, you can help drop blood pressure. So there's a class of drugs called ACE inhibitors. So just this kind of thing, now you know what ACE is, what happens if you inhibit ACE? So that's kind of what I'm asking here. Well, let's think about this. You got ACE, and ACE was responsible for converting ANG1 to ANG2. Now you got a drug that inhibits ACE. Tell me about the circulating levels of ANG2. Is it going to go up or down?
Down.
Down. And if you think downstream of that, Comment on the circulating levels of aldosterone, up or down? Down. Therefore, ultimately, you should think this should help drop BP, okay, if that's the desired effect for an ACE inhibiting drug. ACE inhibitor. That would be the effect. Just stop ACE and it will help drop the blood pressure. All right, next zone, Zona Reticularis. Okay, I have some things here. If I could reduce this slide down to one word, you should know that cortisol facilitates gluconeogenesis. So let's remember, it's secreted from Zona Reticularis. The prime metabolic effect is gluconeogenesis. Neo means new, right? You're making new carb. Okay? Basically, you're making carb from non-carb sources. Make carbohydrate, carb, from non-carbs. Fat, protein. Okay, those are your non-carb sources. So cells can do that. You can break molecules apart and you can reform them into carbohydrates. They started off as other things. Fat and protein. Now, the reason why this is a stress response is because why would you want to do this? You would want to do this, okay, normally you get your carbohydrate from glycogen, long chain of simple sugars. You just cleave off the simple sugars from your glycogen to get your blood glucose. In a stress response, the brain can only metabolize sugar because nothing else can cross the blood-brain barrier. So in a stress response, it's very important to spare your glycogen. So when you do this and make carbs from something else, you spare glycogen as a result. You save it for the brain. Spare glycogen. Save it for the brain. Then you might think, well, if you have it, why don't you just use it all? If you have glycogen, just use it all and then do this. I mean, the body doesn't, I guess it doesn't think that way. I always think of it as, let's say you have a savings account, I don't know, like a few grand, and you want to save it for what? For those unexpected expenses, your car breaks down, medical expenses, something like that. You don't want to use it. You want to save it. Okay? You don't want to burn through it every month and try to reaccumulate it. You want to save it for that very important thing. And the body's the same way. You want to save this for the brain because once you use it, that's it. So by doing this, you can do that. You spare your glycogen. Save it for the brain. The other things listed here, I thought these are new slides, new figures from the latest edition of the Marriott book to kind of sum up the adrenal gland. This says short term, so they show a picture of a guy running from a fire, right? Short term. These are all the physiological effects of the short term stress response that we've talked about before, but let's review them. So getting away from cortisol. adrenal gland, your major stress response organ. And I said it's short term as well as long term. Now, which one was the short term part for? Was it the cortex or the medulla for short term? Medulla was for the short term. And I said E and NE. And this kind of nicely reviews the effects of catecholamines, increased heart rate and blood pressure for cardiovascular, increased HR, increased BP. I also said that, well, for breathing, you dilate bronchioles. Those are the smallest airways, so you increase airflow to the lungs. Dilate bronchioles. Metabolic effects. This says increased blood glucose. It says liver will convert glycogen to glucose. You make energy available, for the essential organs. So, increased blood glucose. The way you say that is glycogenolysis. Glycogenolysis, not gluconeogenesis. This simply means break down glycogen stores in a short-term stress response. That's mainly what you got to know. Okay, but the picture up there is useful too. It reminds you that the adrenal medulla is stimulated by sympathetic efferents. Talked about that the last time. The long-term stress response by corticosteroids, cortex, corticosteroids, mostly from the top two zones, glomerulosa fasciculata. So let's see what it says here. Glucocorticoids, mineralocorticoids. I know you can't read it there. Let me write it on the board. What was the one mineralocorticoid I said you got to know? The salt one. Starts with an A. Aldosterone. What did it do to blood levels of sodium, up or down? From the kidney, it retains it, increases it, and the ultimate effect is the increased blood pressure. I went through that whole thing. So that's great for a stress response. The other major one is cortisol. And it increases glucose for the brain. You kind of see it over there. Let me go back over here. The word was gluconeogenesis. That'll increase blood glucose. But I'm hoping that you're going to see that glycogenolysis increases blood glucose. Gluconeogenesis increases blood glucose. Are those two words the same thing?
No.
The answer is no. This one, you're breaking down glycogen stores. Okay. I mean, this one you're not. You're getting it from other sources. Okay. Over the long term. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll do the gonads. Do about a 20-minute break. Come back at around 10:05.